The regimental medical officer looked at his watch in the dim pre-dawn light of July 25, 1944, noting that it read 0430 hours, and in his mind he was already calculating casualty projections for the operation that would begin in less than 90 minutes. His aid station was positioned 300 meters behind the forward assembly areas where two Canadian infantry companies were preparing to assault a heavily fortified German position near the village of Verrières in Normandy, a ridge that Allied command had designated as a critical objective for the breakout operations that would determine whether the invasion succeeded or stalled into another grinding stalemate. The intelligence briefings had been frank about expected casualties. German forces holding the ridge included elite SS Panzer divisions with extensive combat experience, and they had been preparing defensive positions for weeks, creating interlocking fields of fire and pre-registered artillery targets that would turn any approach into a killing ground. The medical officer had 12 medics assigned to support the two attacking companies, men who had trained for years in treating battlefield trauma and who understood that their role required moving forward into fire to reach wounded soldiers, rather than waiting for casualties to be brought to them. What none of them knew as they made final preparations was that the next 9 hours would see every single one of them shot before the last wound was treated, a casualty rate among medical personnel that seemed statistically impossible, yet would be documented in after-action reports that shocked even veteran commanders accustomed to the brutal arithmetic of infantry combat. Verrières Ridge had become an obsession for Allied planners by late July 1944, as the Normandy campaign threatened to bog down into attritional warfare that negated the advantages the D-Day landings had created. The ridge dominated the surrounding terrain, providing German observers with clear views of Allied positions and approach routes, allowing them to direct artillery fire with devastating accuracy against any movement in the area. Multiple previous attempts to capture the ridge had failed with heavy casualties. British and Canadian forces repeatedly attacking into prepared defenses that extracted terrible costs without achieving breakthrough. The German forces defending the position understood its importance and had been reinforced with some of their best remaining formations, troops who had fought on the Eastern Front and knew how to conduct defensive operations against numerically superior attackers. The result was a tactical situation where attacking forces faced not just strong defensive positions, but experienced defenders who would exploit every advantaged terrain and preparation provided. The Canadian forces tasked with the latest assault on Verrières Ridge carried the weight of previous failures and the knowledge that this attack was considered essential for the entire campaign's success. The units selected for the operation included veteran formations that had fought through Sicily and up the Italian peninsula, soldiers who understood what they were facing and what would be required to succeed. Their officers had studied the previous failed attacks and attempted to develop approaches that would avoid the mistakes that had led to those failures. But the fundamental problem remained that attacking prepared positions required exposing infantry to fire during approaches and assaults, creating casualties that medics would need to treat under conditions where reaching wounded men often proved as dangerous as the combat that had wounded them. The doctrine for medical support in assault operations emphasized forward positioning of aid stations and aggressive forward movement of medics to reach casualties quickly, principles based on the understanding that rapid treatment significantly improved survival rates for many types of battlefield trauma. This doctrine had proven effective in previous operations, but it presumed a certain level of enemy respect for medical personnel that would not materialize in the coming battle. The role of combat medics in World War II infantry operations encompassed far more than the simple first aid that civilian emergency responders provided, requiring these men to perform sophisticated medical interventions under fire while managing the psychological trauma of treating horrific wounds on soldiers who were often friends or close comrades. Medic training included extensive instruction in treating penetrating trauma, managing shock, controlling hemorrhage, and stabilizing casualties for evacuation, skills that took months to develop and required both technical knowledge and the mental fortitude to function effectively when surrounded by chaos and violence. The Red Cross armbands and helmet markings that identified medics were supposed to provide protection under international law, conventions that theoretically prohibited deliberately targeting medical personnel who were clearly marked and performing humanitarian functions. The reality of combat often diverged from these legal principles, particularly in intense close-quarters fighting where distinguishing combatants from medics proved difficult, or where some forces deliberately ignored protections for medical personnel. But most armies, including the German military, generally attempted to respect medical markings when tactical situations allowed. The question that would haunt the survivors of the Verrières Ridge assault and puzzle analysts studying the battle afterward centered on how 12 medics supporting a two-company attack could all be shot in a 9-hour period, a casualty rate that suggested either catastrophic bad luck or something more systematic about how the engagement unfolded. Medics faced danger in any combat operation, but they typically suffered casualties at rates lower than the infantry they supported, their medical markings and non-combatant status providing some protection even in intense fighting. The complete casualty rate among medical personnel at Verrières pointed to conditions where normal patterns of combat casualty distribution had been overwhelmed by the sheer intensity and chaos of the fighting, or where medical markings had provided no protection because German defenders were either unable to distinguish medics in the confusion or had made deliberate decisions to engage any personnel moving in their fire zones regardless of markings. Understanding what happened during those 9 hours requires examining not just the tactical events, but the human experiences of medics who continued treating casualties even after being wounded themselves, soldiers who fulfilled their medical duties under conditions that would have broken less dedicated or trained personnel. The training that Canadian combat medics underwent before deployment to combat zones reflected hard lessons learned from earlier campaigns about what medical support for infantry operations actually required under battlefield conditions. The romantic notion of peaceful medical personnel treating wounded while combat raged around them bore little resemblance to the reality where medics often found themselves under direct fire while attempting to reach casualties, where they needed to make instant triage decisions about which wounded soldiers could be saved and which were beyond help, and where their own survival required combat skills and tactical awareness in addition to medical competence. The curriculum included not just medical procedures, but also tactical movement, weapons familiarization despite their non-combatant status, camouflage and concealment, and psychological preparation for the moral challenges of battlefield medicine, where resources were always inadequate and choices involved tragic trade-offs. Many medics were soldiers who had initially trained as infantry before transferring to medical roles, bringing combat experience that proved invaluable when they needed to function effectively while under fire. The medics assigned to support the Verrières Ridge assault represented a cross-section of Canadian society transformed into battlefield medical personnel through intensive training and previous combat experience. Some had medical backgrounds from civilian life, pre-war nurses or medical students who had enlisted and found themselves applying their knowledge in circumstances no civilian hospital prepared them for. Others had no medical background before military service, but had proven aptitude during training and developed skills through months of treating combat casualties in Italy. What united them was acceptance of a role that required moving toward danger when every instinct screamed to seek cover, staying exposed while treating wounded men when incoming fire made even experienced infantry soldiers hug the ground, and continuing to function while surrounded by death and suffering that would psychologically break many people. The bonds between medics and the infantry they supported were intense and mutual, soldiers knowing that if they were hit, the medics would come for them regardless of danger, medics understanding that infantrymen would provide covering fire and protection when they were working on casualties. The pre-assault briefing for medical personnel included frank discussion of expected casualty rates and the challenges the terrain and enemy dispositions would create for casualty evacuation. The open ground approaching Verrières Ridge offered minimal cover, and German defensive positions commanded clear fields of fire across the entire approach, meaning wounded soldiers would likely fall in areas exposed to continued fire where treating them would require medics to work while under direct observation and engagement. The aid station positioning reflected a compromise between being close enough to reach casualties quickly and far enough back to provide some protection for medical personnel and the wounded being treated. But everyone understood that in this operation the usual distinctions between frontline combat zones and rear area medical facilities would become meaningless. The German artillery had already demonstrated its ability to reach well behind Canadian forward positions, and the likelihood of penetrating attacks meant that nowhere could be considered truly safe once the assault began. The medics listened to these briefings with professional calm that masked the fear any reasonable person would feel, knowing they were about to enter an environment where the casualty projections suggested many of them would be wounded or killed. The assault began at 0600 with a massive artillery preparation that pounded German positions along the ridge. Thousands of shells churning the earth and filling the air with smoke and debris that obscured visibility and created a false sense that enemy defenses must have been obliterated by such overwhelming firepower. The infantry companies moved forward through this maelstrom into ground that had been transformed into a lunar landscape of craters and destroyed vegetation, advancing with the confidence that comes from thorough training and the desperate hope that maybe this time the artillery had done enough damage to German defenses to make the assault survivable. The first casualties occurred within minutes as German machine gun positions that had survived in deep bunkers opened fire on the advancing infantry, men falling and crying out for medics who immediately began moving forward to reach them. The pattern that would characterize the entire 9-hour battle established itself in these first minutes. Wounded soldiers scattered across open ground where treating them meant exposing medics to the same fire that had hit the casualties, creating a terrible calculus where saving lives required accepting risks that made more casualties virtually inevitable. The first medic was shot less than 20 minutes into the assault while treating a soldier who had taken machine gun fire to the legs and was bleeding out in a shell crater 200 meters from the German main defensive line. The medic had reached the casualty by crawling and moving during brief pauses in the fire, had gotten tourniquets applied and was preparing to move the wounded man back toward friendly lines when a German marksman who had been tracking his movement fired a single shot that struck the medic in the upper chest, puncturing his lung and putting him down beside the soldier he had been trying to save. A second medic who had been working another casualty nearby saw his comrade go down and made the instant decision to move to him, despite knowing it meant exposing himself to the same marksman, reaching the first medic and beginning treatment while infantrymen tried to provide suppressing fire against the German positions. The intensity of fire made working on both casualties impossible, so the second medic made the agonizing triage decision to focus on the infantry soldier whose wounds were more immediately survivable, applying the treatment the first medic had begun and then dragging him toward cover while the wounded medic remained in the crater losing blood and consciousness. This scene would repeat with variations throughout the day as medics became casualties while treating casualties, creating cascading situations where medical resources were consumed, treating medical personnel even as the number of wounded infantry continued to mount. By the third hour of the battle, the tactical situation had deteriorated into a nightmare of confused close-quarters combat, where the neat lines on operational maps bore no resemblance to the chaos of actual fighting across terrain that channeled movement and created isolated pockets of soldiers cut off from support. The Canadian assault had penetrated German forward positions in several locations but lacked the strength to exploit these gains or link them into a coherent breakthrough, leaving small groups of infantry holding exposed positions while German forces maneuvered to isolate and eliminate them. The medics found themselves spread across this fragmented battlefield, treating casualties in multiple locations while under fire from multiple directions. The normal systems for casualty evacuation breaking down as stretcher bearers were killed or wounded, and the routes back to aid stations came under increasingly heavy fire. The distinctive red cross markings that identified medical personnel made them visible to both friendly forces seeking medical help and enemy forces whose fire did not discriminate between combatants and medical personnel when both were moving in the same confused battle space. The German defenders fighting from prepared positions around Verrières Ridge were experiencing their own desperate struggle as the Canadian assault pressed forward with an intensity that threatened to overwhelm defensive lines through sheer aggressive momentum. These were veteran troops from SS Panzer divisions who had faced massed Soviet attacks on the Eastern Front and knew that wavering or breaking could mean annihilation, fighting with the desperate effectiveness that comes from understanding that only holding their positions offered any hope of survival. The close ranges at which much of the combat occurred made distinguishing marked medical personnel from combatants difficult in the smoke and chaos, machine gunners firing at movement and snipers engaging targets based on brief glimpses through dust and debris. Some German soldiers later claimed they had not realized they were firing on medics until after the battle, when they could examine the bodies and see the medical markings, while others admitted that in the intensity of close combat where every Canadian soldier represented a mortal threat, they had not considered the distinction between combatants and medical personnel when engaging targets. The 4th and 5th medics became casualties within minutes of each other during a particularly intense period when a German counterattack threatened to overrun a Canadian position, and medics found themselves having to choose between abandoning wounded or staying with them and facing almost certain death or capture. The 4th medic had been treating multiple casualties in a destroyed farm building when German infantry began assaulting the position, the wounded unable to move and requiring someone to remain with them even as the tactical situation became hopeless. The medic stayed, continuing to work on casualties as German soldiers entered the building, and was shot when he refused to stop treating a wounded Canadian soldier at German orders to move away. The 5th medic was hit while attempting to drag wounded soldiers from the same building after it came under German fire, exposing himself repeatedly to pull men to safety until a burst of automatic weapons fire struck him and left him immobilized beside the casualties he had been trying to save. These incidents exemplified the impossible moral choices medics faced throughout the battle. Situations where their duties to treat wounded conflicted with any reasonable assessment of tactical circumstances and personal survival, and where their training and sense of obligation drove them to accept risks that resulted in them becoming casualties themselves. By hour 6, the medical situation had become catastrophic with 8 of 12 medics wounded, casualty numbers climbing past 100 wounded soldiers requiring treatment, and the aid station itself coming under direct fire as German artillery ranged across the entire Canadian position. The remaining 4 medics found themselves attempting to perform triage and treatment for overwhelming numbers of casualties with grossly inadequate resources, making terrible decisions about which wounded soldiers would receive the limited medical supplies and attention available and which would have to wait with whatever field expedient treatment could be provided quickly. The physical and psychological demands on these men exceeded what any training could prepare them for. Working continuously for hours without rest while surrounded by wounded and dying soldiers, many of whom they knew personally, their hands covered in blood and their medical supplies running critically low. The 7th medic was hit by artillery fragments while working in the aid station itself, the supposedly protected rear area becoming just another part of the battlefield as German fire reached across the entire Canadian position. The final 3 medics continued functioning even as the tactical situation made their survival seem increasingly unlikely, treating casualties under fire with a mechanical determination that was beyond courage or duty, and entered the realm of behavior that could only be explained by complete commitment to their role regardless of personal cost. The 8th and 9th medics were shot within an hour of each other while moving forward to reach casualties in exposed positions, both continuing to provide treatment even after being wounded themselves until blood loss and shock finally forced them to stop. The 10th medic was hit by machine gun fire while attempting to evacuate wounded from a position that German forces were assaulting, killed instantly while dragging a soldier toward cover. The 11th medic took a sniper round through the shoulder while working in what should have been a covered position, the wound severe enough to end his ability to function effectively but not immediately life-threatening. The final medic remained the last medical personnel still capable of functioning as the battle entered its 9th hour, moving between casualties and providing what treatment he could while understanding that he was statistically certain to be hit if he continued exposing himself to fire. His luck, or protection, or whatever force had kept him functioning longer than his 11 comrades finally ran out when artillery fire wounded him severely, leaving the 2 Canadian companies with no remaining medical support, just as German forces were mounting their final major counterattack of the engagement. The aftermath of the 9-hour battle revealed casualty figures that shocked even commanders accustomed to the brutal arithmetic of infantry combat in Normandy, with the 2 Canadian companies suffering over 60% casualties, including killed and wounded, and the complete incapacitation of all 12 assigned medics, representing a medical casualty rate that appeared unprecedented in comparable operations. The tactical outcome remained ambiguous, with Canadian forces holding portions of the contested ground, but unable to secure the entire objective, and German defenses disrupted, but not broken, creating a situation where both sides could claim elements of success while recognizing the terrible costs paid. The medical situation had been catastrophic, with many wounded soldiers receiving only minimal or delayed treatment because of the complete loss of medical personnel, though surprisingly the mortality rate among wounded proved lower than casualty projections had feared, perhaps because medics had managed to perform critical interventions before being incapacitated, or because soldiers provided buddy aid when no medics remained available. The investigation into how all 12 medics assigned to the operation had been shot attempted to determine whether this represented statistical anomaly, systematic failure in medical doctrine, or evidence of German forces deliberately targeting medical personnel in violation of international law. The analysis concluded that multiple factors had combined to create the catastrophic medical casualty rate rather than any single cause, including the unusually intense and confused nature of fighting at close quarters, where medical markings provided limited protection, the extended duration of combat in the same limited area that exposed medics to cumulative risk over 9 hours, the aggressive forward movement doctrine that positioned medics in areas of heavy fire to reach casualties quickly, and possibly some instances where German forces had engaged marked medical personnel, either unknowingly in the chaos or deliberately when tactical situations made them disregard such distinctions. The report stopped short of accusing German forces of systematic war crimes regarding medical personnel, while acknowledging that the protection international law theoretically provided had proven meaningless in the intensity of this particular engagement. The human cost extended beyond the simple casualty statistics to encompass the psychological trauma experienced by surviving medics who had been wounded while treating casualties, and by infantry soldiers who had witnessed medics being shot while attempting to help them. Several of the wounded medics suffered from profound guilt about casualties they had been unable to treat or had been forced to abandon when they themselves were incapacitated, psychological wounds that proved as debilitating as their physical injuries, and that persisted long after their bodies healed. Infantry veterans of the battle reported nightmares about watching medics being shot while moving to help wounded soldiers, images that haunted them decades after the war ended, and that represented the most traumatic memories from combat experiences that included numerous horrific events. The breakdown of medical support during the battle had forced soldiers to provide aid to their wounded comrades using only basic battlefield first aid knowledge, creating situations where men watched friends die from wounds that proper medical treatment might have saved. The broader implications for Canadian military medical doctrine prompted extensive review of how combat medics were employed in assault operations and whether the aggressive forward positioning that had seemed appropriate in previous campaigns remained valid given the intensity of combat in Normandy. Some medical officers argued that the Verrières experience demonstrated the need for more conservative positioning of medical personnel, with greater reliance on trained infantry stretcher bearers to move casualties back to aid stations rather than having medics move forward into heavy fire zones. Others maintained that forward medical positioning remained essential for saving lives, and that the Verrières casualty rate represented an extreme outlier that should not drive fundamental doctrine changes. The debate reflected deeper tensions about how military organizations balanced accepting risks to medical personnel against the treatment advantages forward positioning provided for wounded soldiers, a calculation that involved both tactical considerations and moral questions about the appropriate level of danger medical personnel should face. The recognition and commemoration of the medics who had been shot during the 9-hour battle created uncomfortable questions about how their sacrifice should be understood and honored, whether they were heroes who had exemplified the highest standards of military medical service or victims of doctrine that had placed them in untenable situations where casualties were virtually inevitable. All 12 were recommended for decorations recognizing their courage and dedication to duty, though several awards were downgraded by higher commands who questioned whether soldiers were simply doing their assigned jobs should receive recognition for actions that were expected of them. The families of medics who had died during the battle struggled with the knowledge that their loved ones had been killed while performing humanitarian functions that theoretically should have been protected, losses that seemed particularly cruel because medical personnel were non-combatants whose role was saving lives rather than taking them. The survivors carried the weight of having been part of a medical casualty rate that seemed statistically impossible yet had occurred, a shared experience that bonded them even as it isolated them from others who could not truly understand what they had endured. The legacy of the 9-hour battle where every Canadian medic was shot extends beyond military medical history to encompass broader questions about the nature of combat heroism and the costs societies accept when they send soldiers into war. The story became part of Canadian military lore as an example of extraordinary dedication and sacrifice. Medics who had continued performing their duties, even when doing so made them casualties, and who had exemplified the highest standards of military medical service under conditions that tested human endurance beyond normal limits. Yet this celebration of heroism existed in tension with the recognition that the complete medical casualty rate represented a catastrophic failure that had left wounded soldiers without proper care, and that raised questions about whether doctrine and planning had been adequate for the tactical situation faced. The tension between honoring sacrifice and learning from failure remains unresolved in how the battle is remembered and taught to subsequent generations of military medical personnel. The individual experiences of the 12 medics who were shot during the battle reveal the human reality underlying historical analysis and doctrinal debates about combat medical operations. Each had his own story of how he had come to be a combat medic, his own relationships with the soldiers he served, his own moment of being hit, and the realization that he had become a casualty, and his own struggle with physical wounds and psychological trauma in the aftermath. Some recovered and returned to duty, carrying the experience with them through subsequent operations and eventually home to post-war lives where they rarely spoke about what they had endured. Others died from their wounds either immediately or after evacuation to field hospitals, their final hours spent in the care of other medical personnel who understood what they had been doing when they were shot. Several survivors dealt with their trauma through dedicating themselves to improving combat medical care in ways that might prevent future repetitions of what had happened at Verrières, becoming advocates for better equipment, revised doctrine, and more realistic training about the dangers medical personnel faced in modern combat. The German perspective on the battle, and specifically on the medical casualty rate, remains fragmentary and difficult to assess, given the chaos of the engagement and the later reluctance of many German veterans to discuss actions that might be construed as war crimes. Some former German soldiers who fought at Verrières claimed they had been unaware they were engaging medical personnel in the confusion of close combat where distinguishing markings proved difficult or impossible to identify. Others acknowledged that medical markings had been visible, but argued that in the intensity of fighting, where survival required engaging any threat, immediately they had not had time to consider distinctions between combatants and medical personnel. A few admitted that orders or unit culture in some SS formations included disregard for protections that international law theoretically afforded medical personnel, viewing such conventions as luxuries that combat conditions did not allow. The complexity of assigning responsibility or blame for the medical casualties reflects broader difficulties in understanding how laws of war apply in the chaos of actual combat, where split-second decisions made under extreme stress determine life and death. The evolution of combat medical doctrine in the decades following World War II incorporated lessons from battles like Verrières about the vulnerabilities medical personnel faced and the need for systems that could maintain medical support even when primary medical personnel became casualties. Modern military medical training emphasizes that all soldiers need combat lifesaver skills that allow them to provide sophisticated trauma care rather than relying entirely on specialized medics, distributing medical capability more broadly across units. Advances in helicopter evacuation reduced the need for medical personnel to move forward into heavy fire zones to reach casualties, allowing faster evacuation to surgical facilities that improved survival rates. Body armor and improved battlefield medicine reduced mortality rates for many wound types that would have been fatal in earlier conflicts. Yet the fundamental tension remains between the need to provide rapid medical care to wounded soldiers and the reality that doing so often requires medical personnel to expose themselves to the dangers that created the casualties they are treating. The final accounting of the 9-hour battle where every Canadian medic was shot must acknowledge both the extraordinary courage and dedication these men demonstrated and the failures in planning and doctrine that put them in such a catastrophic situation. Their story stands as testament to the best and worst aspects of military service, the capacity for selfless sacrifice in service of others, and the institutional systems that sometimes demand such sacrifice without adequate consideration of whether the costs are justified or necessary. The medics who continued treating casualties even after being wounded themselves exemplified ideals of military medical service that inspire subsequent generations, while their collective fate stands as warning about the terrible costs of combat and the importance of ensuring that sacrifice serves genuine operational necessity rather than resulting from inadequate preparation or flawed doctrine. Their memory endures not just in official histories and commemorations, but in the lived experience of military medical personnel who understand that their role requires accepting risks that others avoid, moving toward danger when every instinct screams to seek safety, and continuing to function when surrounded by death and suffering because wounded soldiers depend on them regardless of the personal costs involved.